And now we go on to another one of the ultimate classics of the season, which is really interesting because I'm assuming most people know by now that it actually didn't start that way, like, at all. Where, when it came out in 1946, it really wasn't that popular at all. Like, it really didn't have, like, a big draw, despite the fact that it found decent Oscar success with getting Best Picture, Director, and Actor nominations, as well as editing and sound, I believe. But for the most part, it kind of just came and went and was forgotten, which is really bizarre to think about. Anyway, like, it seemed more of a like an advertising thing rather than a people saw it and forgot about it. It's just that nobody really saw it, because obviously with the impact that it has, would be very hard to ignore. But the thing about that is it kind of felt the same way for a while there. I think for the most part, people have finally started, like, laying more eyes on it, because obviously it went into the public domain, and then that's when it started being seen by more people and became like an annual thing. But the thing about that was, it was that, like, that gave it certainly a popularity, but for a while it feels like, anyway, I can't necessarily prove this, but it felt like for a while there it was one of those movies where everybody knew about it, like, everybody knew the gist of it and the story and the whole, seeing your life without you in it sort of thing, and, like, knowing when it's on and all that, but that nobody you kind of knew personally had actually seen it, like, all the way through. Like, it's one of those movies that people know so much about, but there's also so many that probably haven't seen it from beginning to end. Um, and it's especially with that, where it has this reputation as being one of the ultimate Christmas movies, despite the fact that Christmas comes into the movie so late. Like, it's basically just the ending, but it's just the movie has such, like, an epic, like, the structure of it. There's a big chunk of it that you can call the ending, really, depending on how you're looking at, like, the story as a whole. And the thing about that is, because there's so much, like, going on in it, like, there's so many different facets to it. Like, you can, because obviously George is the center of it. But one of the things you can see is, like, a crucial thread throughout the whole thing, and as a driving force, is there's a bit of a love story, not necessarily at its center, but very close to the heart of it. This whole thing from beginning to end that starts with him knowing the Donnery character when they were children, and there's that moment at the shop at the very beginning when she bends down and whispers into his bad ear, knowing that he won't hear it, that she's gonna love him for as long as she lives. And it's like, from that point on, you could technically say the movie is a love story. There's just so much also going on, but it's definitely a major aspect of it and gives it a whole other, like many aspects of the movie, it gives it a heart in, like, a really warm way, but then also can be part of the darker aspects of it as it goes as well. And that's even when the love story is really, like, getting to its peak, when they decide that they're going to get married, even then there's still something that's, because the interesting thing about the title of the movie itself is that there's such, like, almost like a, I wouldn't say, like, irony or double meaning, but it's because it starts off and you can sense, like, a very upbeat attitude, despite some dramatic stuff like his brother falling through the ice, but he ultimately saves him, and despite the fact that the pharmacist almost killed somebody, but then he figured it out and everything was eventually okay. And that's kind of they keep saying that, where, like, things will go to crap, but eventually they'll be okay. It's the whole arc of the movie as a whole, but there's also all those individual moments that do it also. And so it's kind of the back and forth of, it's like, the title's almost like the ultimate, like, the very last step of, like, life itself, when you're gonna, because it's obviously, you look at the title and you think feel good movie immediately, and it's like, oh, this must be about somebody's wonderful life. In a sense, it is, but it can also be, you can almost say that as sarcasm in many aspects also. Very, very dark sarcasm, if you want to. And so, yeah, so when you have moments like when their kids are they're in the shop and all that, or when they have the little moments like like still towards the beginning after they're leaving the school after they fall into the pool, and there's like this whole you would think you're watching a romantic comedy in this scene when he says like, I'll give you the moon, and she loses her robe and goes behind the bush and all that. But then there's like an immediate darkness that hits where like these scenes are always interrupted by the darknesses in life. Like there's the whole scene that looks like it's a romantic comedy where she's in the bush, and then suddenly he's informed that his dad has had a stroke and eventually dies. And that's just kind of the whole thing where life just his eventually wonderful life for a long time is just getting like desperately in his way, and it's this whole dream that he has of going, getting away and going somewhere better and living this much more extravagant life. And there's just always that setback, and like most of the movie is him watching his life pass him by, which if it's also like if you also have those sort of like dreams or things you really want to do with your wife, with your life, well, either, is it's like really drastically like you feel that so much when you're watching this, when it's like the way it's so casual because of how fast life starts to move, especially when it's passing you by, and the way it kind of there's just like one cut, there's a fade out and then a fade back in, and then the angels narrating just casually say, and then George got 4 years older. And it's like, because it feels, when it happens, it just feels like it's that fast. Like, you think about 4 years ago. 4 years ago was 2015. And it's like, yeah, a fade out and then a fade in, that's about how quickly it went. And it's stuff like that just really captures something really real. Without even necessarily having to do anything particularly, big and showy with the movie itself. But you can say the movie does get melodramatic. Like one of the darker aspects of them, not necessarily darker, but not particularly happy and romantic comedy like when they actually do end up together, the two of them, and decide to get married. Is this scene when she she's got Sam Wainwright on the phone and they just push him to the side literally, and he does like the whole it's something you would see a lot in the classic sort of romance movies where there was like a roughness to it, like the way he's like violently shaking her trying to prove a point and like just put all the feelings out there. There's a certain dated quality to that, I would like to think, to an extent. But as far as like the drama of the movie, the emotion is definitely there in that moment. And it does feel like it is an inevitable conclusion that we immediately fade out on that and then back into the climax of their wedding as they're getting ready to take off. And then, once again, just the whole, every time there's something that seems like it's wonderful, there's that piece of life that gets in the way. In this case, just as they're going on their honeymoon, we have the amazing scene at the savings and loan where he has to use their honeymoon money in order to save the entire place. And it's always been one of my favorite scenes in the movie because it really shows, like, it makes George such, like, an almost saintly figure, but without taking that overboard. Like, he's still, especially with all these moments where life keeps getting in the way, there's always something to ground this movie when it feels like it's getting overly spectacular. Even when they bring angels down to earth and show him hypothetical scenarios, there's still such like this painful truth in them regardless, where we take the fantastical element and they kind of have some comedic fun with it, like when Clarence introduces himself and he's explaining it and the other guy in the room just like freaks out and leaves. But then, like we say, you follow that up with the scenes where George sees life without him, and suddenly the movie gets very dark, very fast, and ultimately very depressing. And that's the kind of beauty of the movie, is how it goes as deep into that sort of depressed state as far as it can, so that it's all the more triumphant when we do come out on the other side, finally, for good. And the movie does give you the sense that, like, but not in, like, a pessimistic way or a downbeat way, but it does give you the vibe that this won't necessarily be the end of their troubles when we get to the end of the movie. despite the fact that it's so, like, they feel so rich in the moment, and there's the thing where, as long as he has friends and all these people that he was good to, and they're repaying the favor and all that, and it's just a forever ongoing thing that they will be fine, but it's not like their troubles are going to be over. It's grounded in realism enough to keep that in mind, but it by no means feels like downbeat. So that's capturing that is really actually really appreciated more than anything else, because that's kind of what you want in an inspirational movie, where it's like there's such a realism in it, it doesn't feel too much like an ending like that is out of reach for real people in real life. And it's really I think another thing I love so much about the savings and loan scene is that when we do get to the end and everybody's coming in with the money and all that and keeping him out of jail, there is in another movie it would seem very cheesy and very over the top and very like idealistic, and it's like, oh, we just suddenly have all this money we're gonna give you. But the fact that it is like this flawless payoff, where it's the reverse of the savings and loan scene, where he gave all of his money to all these people and they're repaying him, not just literally repaying him in money, but repaying the graceful gesture that was, and it just comes full circle in this really beautiful way. Obviously, this movie has like one of the best endings of all time. One of the most quoted lines in movie history too, I would say. Not just necessarily quoted, but also that scene itself is featured in so many other movies, especially other Christmas movies. And I think that's another thing where it's so associated with being a Christmas movie, despite it only being like the last, third of it or so. Even that's probably being generous. Is that if I've often heard it like described as a reverse A Christmas Carol, where the whole subject of A Christmas Carol is how just just hating the entire world kind of person that Ebenezer Scrooge is, and then ultimately finding his way and becoming, this great and generous person. And it's George starting off as like this really, gracious, generous person, and ultimately ending up where he ends up when he's lost everything. And it's once you hear that comparison, it's like, oh yeah, that's exactly what this movie is. It's just the reverse of A Christmas Carol, but and even with the some sort of like specter-like thing, whether it be ghosts or an angel or whatever, to show him the way things could be, and like the absolute worst case scenario in one way or another, and ultimately making you appreciate even the thing on the staircase that keeps coming off, and all that just says all that perfectly. And it's also it's worth noting that this was, I think, both Capra and Jimmy Stewart had said that this was their favorites of. Both of them said this was their favorite of all the movies they had ever made. And both of them have pretty extensive and classic filmographies. Capra more so, like a lot of people consider this to be like Capra's, one of his last great ones, and then he kind of started to decline a little bit. But there was also the whole thing where, and to look up on this, there's like a ton of film historians that have gone even deeper into this, but the fact that both Capra and Jimmy Stewart went off to World War II and served extensively, and then when they came back, this was the movie that they both wanted to make that was kind of not necessarily a statement on that exactly, but on people that were in this sort of, pessimistic state that had kind of been basically jaded by everything in everything that had happened up to this point. Which makes this like the perfect story to tell in that sort of moment from these two people that are feeling that so deeply. And when you see like George's descent, because obviously prior to this, Jimmy Stewart, obviously a lot of people like to say that Tom Hanks is the modern day him, and that's obviously referring more to like the just sort of like, I guess, just the joyous way about them in general. And how you see that person and you're like, if I met that person in real life, I feel like they'd be exactly the person I would want them to be. But there's also that Jimmy Stewart basically was that. Like, he was always the character that was in like he had just won his Oscar 6 years prior for an almost entirely comedic role in the Philadelphia story, and he would play parts like that, or inspirational parts like Mr. Smith, which he also did with Capra. And this was like the first real glimpse we got of like the darkness that Stewart could go into, which you can obviously sense is the also kind of the post-war thing, like that's in him there also, and certainly in Capra as a filmmaker also. Like I said, there are historians that have gone way into that, so you can find that stuff. So yeah, and on top of Capra's direction, also that just some of the visual stuff is really good. Also, one of my favorite things in the movie probably is that beginning scene in the pharmacy before he accidentally almost poisons somebody, and the way that the entire realization of George is told visually. There's no dialogue about it. When he puts together where he sees the letter where the pharmacist has been informed that his son has just gotten sick and died, and then he sees the poison bottle and puts two and two together, and then you see him contemplate what he's supposed to do about this, and then there's the ironically jovial sign in the window that says "Ask Dad," that's related to something else entirely. And just all of this, you just see him put it all together at once, what he's going to do in his plan, and there's no words except, like, written. And it's, yeah, so that's just perfect, stuff like that. And of course, gave movie history one of its more hateable villains in Lionel Barrymore's Potter, which is the scenes where George confronts him, or, like, it's one of those cases where you so badly want to see him confront him, but yet it's still that grounded realism where we get what we want to see and what we would expect in a movie, but also grounded in that reality where George still feels so small and helpless in comparison, with just how vicious Potter is and how unbudgeable he is in his nature in general. And it's, yeah, so everything about this comes together in the most beautiful way. So, and like I said, even when it's like, when he's going into his descent, it's so painful, even when it's stuff that we don't need to spend a lot of time with. Like, some of the most heartbreaking stuff in the movie is watching his kids react to him. And the thing about this that makes this so impressive is that prior to this scene, we don't really know the kids. Like, the scene where he blows up at them for the first time, when, like, one of them's trying to play the piano, the other kid's trying to spell, Zuzu is sick upstairs. We've, like, this is basically our introduction to the kids, is this scene. And it is so painful to watch him go off on them one by one and, like, feel like we really, really sympathize with them. Where we get where he's coming from, because obviously it's the whole, when you're in the state that George is, like, the little annoying things are gonna seem so, like, maximized, but that's still, you just feel like your heart just hurts for everybody in the scenario. And that's really the beauty of the movie when it comes out on the other side, and it's reaches that point that, like I said, feels like any other, idealistic Capra ending, but because of that reality they've injected into it, gives it a lot more meaning and a lot more impact. So, yeah, so I think that's that's all you can really say about this, or at least I can. So there's going to be 3 more of these. I'm doing one right after this, and then I'm doing the 2 last ones with my brother. So until all those, I think that's it for this.